Hello and welcome to the Podquest of Bread. Tonight, let's talk about visceral reactions. And I want to talk about visceral reactions because over the last few weeks within the country music world, we have been seeing country music artists take very bold stances pertaining to a certain subject. And what triggered me to make this podcast episode was a final artist, an artist that I value and I love and respect the music of, releasing a surprise album yesterday. The album is called Long Violent History. It is a amazing trip through Kentucky bluegrass music. It's an amazing trip through the culture of Kentucky and where he's from. It is a testament to Appalachian music, Appalachian culture, and Appalachian styling. But at the end of this almost entirely instrumental album, you hit the final song, the title track, Long Violent History. And it hits you almost like a sack of bricks. And of course, the reaction from the country music fans that follow Tyler Childers and didn't realize how socially awake he was and how tuned into the issues happening in our country he was. Of course, the reactions were less than stellar. They were visceral reactions. They were reflections on themselves, even though they didn't realize that they were reflections on themselves. And many of these reactions actually were the exact reactions Tyler spoke about in this song. So I'm going to talk about some of the other artists that have made stances. And these artists are longtime country music artists. They are icons in the industry. And they are people whom have a very varied fan base. And some of which may not support the Black Lives Matter movement, nor believe that systemic racism exists within the country, and may not also believe in what many of these artists are now coming out and saying. So about a week or so ago, there was this quote. And of course, Black Lives Matter. Do we think our little white asses are the only ones that matter? No. That was Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton, who famously, when she found out that the word Dixie was offensive, and this was a couple years ago, renamed parts of the park that is named after her, because she doesn't want to offend people and because she wants to respect the feelings of others. Chris Stapleton said, "Do I think Black Lives Matter? Absolutely. I don't know how you could think they don't." Again, a statement from a country music artist who has released absolutely amazing tracks and written songs for some of the biggest artists in the industry. And then there's Chris Stapleton, who, while speaking on the matter of Black Lives Matter, in a video that he released to partner with the song, Tyler Childers says this: "We can stop being so taken aback by Black Lives Matter. If we didn't need to be reminded, there would be justice for Breonna Taylor, a Kentuckian like me, and countless others." What we are witnessing right now is country music artists taking a stand in territories that they traditionally would not be expected to take stands in, recognizing the things that need to be recognized. But Tyler Childers, and I want to give props to him, did this in a way that I think is absolutely beautiful. And that does cause visceral reactions to the lyrics within the song Long Violent History. Now, before I discuss walking within shoes, and before I preach to you a little bit, any of my fan base that are in viewership that might watch this and want to have a visceral reaction, let me read a couple lyrics from this song. He starts it off with a literal pile of bricks slapped against your face after this fiddle and guitar-laced instrumental album with this lyric: "It's the worst that it's been since the last time it happened. It's happening again right in front of our eyes. There's updated footage, wild speculation, tall tales, hearsay, and absolute lies. Now, there is not a actual line by line meaning for this song that's been released by Tyler or anybody yet, but I want to walk through these lyrics because they are absolutely brilliant. These lyrics take you on the journey of what this movement has been about. This movement that has been about focusing on the fact that Black lives are less than, or held to a level less than that of a white life in the United States of America. And so we start with this one lyric. It's the worst that it's been since the last time it happened. Every time that something occurs that the Black Lives Matter movement must take a stand for, it is literally the same. It's the same cause. But for those watching, it is always the worst one yet since the last time. It's happening again right in front of our eyes because so many people, when they hear about these things, they turn a blind eye. They ignore it. They pretend it's not there. They refuse to take a stand. They refuse to stand with those who believe that Black Lives Matter. There's updated footage and wild speculation. Again, focusing on the fact that this is the same thing in a new situation. It might be a man instead of a woman, or a woman instead of a man, or a child instead of an adult, or an elderly man instead of a middle-aged adult. Updated footage, wild speculation. Because every time that we see someone murdered by the cops, every time we see a Black person murdered by the cops and knelt on their necks, we find people out there pulling up their histories, as if the history of that person, their criminal history or what they've done before, means something in the eyes of being murdered by the law. I'll say something I said earlier tonight as I was out at a protest. Guilty people aren't supposed to be murdered by the cops. Wild speculation, tall tales, hearsay, and absolute lies. Because on top of these people's histories being drug up, lies and false histories are concocted and crafted to justify the murder of this person. Oh, he sold crack once. Oh, he stole a bike. That's totally justification for him being knelt on, having his neck knelt on for 8 minutes and 47 seconds. That's justification for the cops knocking down their door and shooting her dead on her couch in her sleep. These are all things that we see happen. Now, Tyler goes on after a few parts of the lyrics to say, now what would you give if you heard my opinion, conjecturing on matters that I ain't never dreamed? In all my born days as a white boy from Hickman, based on the way the world's been to me. Right there, Tyler takes another stance. It's a vivid stance. It is a definite stance on the white privilege that he has, the privilege of the color of his skin, and what's afforded to him based upon where he is in the culture and the upbringing he's had. Tyler Childers says, conjecturing on matters that I ain't never dreamed. One of my favorite phrases to kind of sum this up is, I'll never understand, but I will stand with you. Saying that I will never understand what it's like to have to walk down the streets and look over your shoulder for fear that someone is judging what you may be doing just based upon the pigmentation of your skin. I've never had to do that because I am a white boy. I'm white. I don't know what that's like. He goes, based on the way the world's been to me, again, referencing the privilege of how he was raised in his upbringing, how he's been able to live his life, and how it's supported him and enabled him to become what he is today. But there is a lyric that I think is perfect to lead me into what Tyler talks about in a separate video that he put out there. And that is, how many boys could they haul off this mountain, shoot full of holes, cuffed and laid in the streets, till we come into town in a stark raven anger, looking for answers and armed to the teeth? 30-06's Pawpaw's old pistol. How many you reckon would it be? 4 or 5? Oh, would that be the start of a long, violent history, tucking our tails as we try to abide? That lyric is actually a reference to something called the Battle of Blair Mountain. The Battle of Blair Mountain is better covered by a separate podcast called the Beau of the Fifth Column, where he actually does a very excellent take on the Battle of Blair Mountain, and that will be in the description of the YouTube video, the Facebook video, once this is done and uploaded. But essentially, it was a bunch of coal miners who went on strike, and strike breakers attempted to come in. They were backed by the operators of the mine. Eventually, the U.S. Army came in, the West Virginia National Guard, and many died. Many white folk died. And those white folk lost their mind. They reacted with visceral rage and visceral anger. They had visceral reactions to the actions taken against them by the authorities. They looted, they burned in their own fashion. They tore down the system that kept them down. And that leads me into the final part here of visceral reaction. And this video that Tyler put out is what really caused the reaction from his base, from his fan base, whom I know he lost a lot yesterday by doing this, but he also gained a lot. In the video he put out, he said that we often fail to empathize with this movement and empathize with how people are feeling because we've never been there. We've never known what it's like, and we'll never understand what it's like. It's impossible to understand what it's like because we don't suffer the same issues. In the video, he said things like, what would it be like if you heard about a Kentucky man being shot as he went into his tackle box to give a game warden his fishing license, but the game warden thought he was going for a gun? What would the reaction be? Or if it was a white nursing student shot dead in her sleep during a no-knock warrant, what would have happened? Tyler takes a lot of the more well-known instances of black people being murdered by the police and twists them to say, what if it was a white person? How would you react? What would you do? Of course you would be out in the streets. You'd be losing your mind and you'd be upset. And here's where I'm going to preach for a moment, because I did a whole episode on the podcast about my upbringing, how I've changed, and how what I used to say, I said it because I couldn't figure out how to look at what they were suffering, what others were suffering, and what I wasn't because of the privilege afforded to me by the pigmentation of my skin. So I'm going to preach for a minute here because it's my podcast and I can. If the next time a black person or a minority or an indigenous people is shot dead in the streets or roughed up and messed or has excessive force used against them by the police, take a moment to imagine what that would be if you were looking at one of your family members or your friends in that same situation. What would you do if you were in that situation? Would your reaction to the event be the same? If it was a white person in that exact situation, what would your reaction be? Because that's what it took for me to understand this movement. It's what it took for me to stand up next to my fellow human and recognize that until Black Lives Matter, all lives can't matter. Until indigenous people's lives matter, all lives cannot matter. Until every single minority is looked at the same in this country as I am, as my life is, I can't stand alone or stand by the side and watch it happen. So I close with this comparison, and it's one of my favorite ones to say. Picture a bunch of children riding their bikes, say 10 of them. They're all riding their bikes. They're having a great time. But one child falls and scuffs up his knee. Do you administer first aid to every single one of those children and put a Band-Aid on each one of their knees? Or do you tend to the one who is actually injured and suffering? I reckon to say that you would tend to the one who's suffering, the one that actually needs help. And that's Black lives right now. So to all those having visceral reactions to Tyler, to Dolly Parton, to all those having visceral reactions to the things Chris Stapleton has said, to Eric Church's song, Stick That in Your Country song, to everyone having these reactions, step back for a minute and just look at it. Just think about it as if they weren't a black person, as if they weren't an indigenous people. Imagine if they were white. How would you react? What would you do? Because I can say I have witnessed white people celebrating sports events and championship games. They've looted and they've burned over a damn game. So getting upset and taking a moral high ground because people are tired of being oppressed in the streets by a fascist government and by fascist regimes operating under that government, taking the moral high ground doesn't make you look good. It shows your racist intentions. Stay beautiful, humans.